But yes, so George Alcock obviously was famous for his discoveries of novae, 5 novae and 5 comets. He was a visual observer, but he depended quite a lot on photography for confirmation of his discoveries. And what I'd like to do over the next 50 minutes or so is take you through a whirlwind tour of basically how photography developed and how it has been used in cometary astronomy over the last 150 years or so. If I could just take the lights down a bit. That should be good enough. Right, okay, so starting off with this picture, this is one of my earliest photographs of a comet, and it was a comet actually discovered by George Alcock. This is a comet that was also discovered by a spacecraft called IRIS and by a Japanese observer, Araki. So it's called Comet IRIS-Araki-Alcock. It was the 5th discovery of George Alcock, and those of you who are old enough to remember it, when it was around in 1983, will remember that it was very special in that it was one of the closest passing comets that we've had. So it moved across the sky very, very rapidly. To show my age, this picture was taken from the Downs in Bristol. I borrowed a camera off somebody. This was when I was at university in Bristol in the early 1980s. So in those days the skies were a bit darker than they are now. But I remember going up on the Downs and just being amazed by this fuzzy object overhead. So George discovered that. He discovered 4 other comets. Starting in 1959, he discovered 2 comets in the space of a month or so. And when he died, the BAA commemorated him with this plaque, which is hanging in Peterborough Cathedral. You can go and see it. I remember distinctly that I was with Tom Bowles at the time, who was the president, and we gave Martin Rees a lift back from that event and almost killed him by Tom actually going around the roundabout the wrong way coming off the M11. I remember sitting in the back of the car that we could kind of be in the journal for more than just unveiling a plaque to George Alcock. Wiping out the astronomer oil would probably not have been a very good thing. So I'll just start right at the very beginning. And looking around the audience, a lot of you are old enough to remember what photography was like before digital imaging, but not quite as far back as this. So I just want to go through, hopefully you can read that little table at the top, and thank you very much to Mike Maunder, who's helped me really a lot with some of these old emulsions. So basically, there's a lot of debate about when photography really started, but kind of in the early 1830s or so, Talbot was experimenting with salted paper. Basically, you would use paper, you pour a solution of sodium chloride and silver nitrate, you make silver nitrate. This stuff was sensitive not. It was photographic material. It had an ISO probably equivalent to what we would now say was about 0.0003 ISO. Now to put that in context, this is probably one of the first photographs known. It's Laycock Abbey. It's a picture of a window where Talbot lived. He took this picture with a pinhole camera. He basically put his salted paper negative in the back of it and left it for many hours and then developed it. So this is essentially where photography started. Exposures of many, many hours to get a picture in bright sunlight. Clearly not really very suitable for astronomy. So the real kind of first photographic process that was kind of useful was the daguerreotype. That also was very, very slow as well, but it was used for an astronomical picture, and I'll show you that in a minute. But a big development was moving on to the wet collodion process. And those of you who are interested in photography will know Julia Margaret Cameron. I absolutely love her photographs. You think of Victorian portrait photographs as being incredibly stuffy and staid. Well, they're not. I mean, look at that. That picture of Ellen Terry, taken in 1864 on wet collodion. Probably, though, an exposure of 2 to 3 minutes at f4. So you imagine that with a camera. You're taking a picture. She had to hold that pose for 2 to 3 minutes. The main reason why most of the Victorian pictures you see look like they're kind of heavily constipated is that they're effectively having to sit still for minutes on end. So the wet collodion process was actually a process that was used for astronomical photography. It wasn't very practical, and I'll explain why in a minute. But the big development was going to dry plates, so gelatin plates. At that point, they reached a sensitivity of maybe 0.2, 0.3 ISO. So still incredibly slow compared to what we're used to today. But they were used for taking pictures of comets. And this picture here by David Gill, it's a picture of the Great Comet of 1882, taken on a gelatin dry plate at the Cape Observatory. 2 hours exposure at f4.4. So again, just showing you the kind of exposures that were necessary. But this is a real proper picture of a comet. It shows the coma and the tail. And admittedly, the brightest comet that there's ever been, pretty much, this comet. This comet was magnitude -15 in the daytime sky. It was actually seen by people observing the sun transiting, going near the limb of the sun and transiting and being eclipsed by the sun. But it was a really bright comet in the daytime sky. David Gill took this picture of it. Winding back a little bit on the daguerreotypes, and I put this in for Bill Ledbarrow because I had to have a non-cometary image. This is probably the first astronomical photograph. Taken by John William Draper, it's a picture of the moon. He clearly had some flat fielding issues. But this was taken in 1840. So this is the moon. You can kind of see that it's the moon-ish. Most of these things are blobs and things on the daguerreotype, but there is some craters there. It's kind of half-phased moon. Have I said really that astronomical photography really started with the wet collodion process? So what's that? I think if you understand what wet collodion is, you realise that if photography was invented now, it would probably be banned. So essentially, wet collodion involved a mixture of all kinds of nasty stuff. So particularly nasty stuff. So there was kind of various volatile chemicals, but particularly nasty stuff was nitrocellulose. And nitrocellulose is also known as gun cotton. And just to give you an example of what happens to gun cotton if you're stupid enough to point a blowtorch at it, and this is one of the really good things that YouTube does, is it gives you videos of people being really stupid. This is what happens. So essentially, what you had to do with this process was mix up all of these things, and whilst they were still wet, put the plate in the camera, take your picture, and then go and develop it. And developing was yet another concoction of deadly chemicals. So, I mean, those of you who are old enough to remember photography back in the kind of 1980s or so will know that chemicals all came in bottles marked with skull and crossbones and all that kind of thing. I remember I used to keep my developer in the fridge to keep it safe, and you had to mark it carefully to make sure nobody thought it was lemonade. But at least we weren't making our sensitive emulsions out of gun, cotton and ether and all the other stuff that they made wet collodion with. But at least wet collodion was sensitive enough to allow people to have a go at taking pictures of comets, because comets generally are faint, fuzzy things that are difficult to photograph. And the first comet that came along basically at the right time to allow this new wet collodion process to be used for comet photography was this one. This is Comet Donati, possibly one of the most beautiful comets ever. And up until Comet Donati appeared, the best records that we've got of comets are drawings and paintings. So this lovely painting by William Turner on October 5th, 1858, showing the comet as it appeared above the fields of Oxfordshire. So there were two people simultaneously who decided they'd have a go at photographing this comet. One of them was a professional astronomer at Harvard called William Bond. He was the director of the Harvard Observatory. He was using a wet collodion plate. He used the great Harvard 15-inch refractor here. You can see it's a really big telescope. One thing you'll notice, it's not the fastest optical system in the world. It's somewhere between f15 and f17. So a pretty slow optical system. He used a 6-minute exposure, tracked using the equatorial mount he had, on September 28, 1858. When he developed the plate after all of that effort, there was just, and it is just, a kind of small blob where the central condensation, the nucleus of the comet was. So this was a comet that was phenomenally bright, and a 6-minute exposure with a 15-inch refractor just about recorded it. And for a long time, people thought that was the first photograph of a comet. But it wasn't, because of this guy. This is a guy called William Usherwood. He was a photographer in Dorking, and he also decided to have a go at photographing this comet, using the same wet collodion process that Bond used. But the big difference was that instead of using a large astronomical telescope with a really slow f ratio, he used a portrait lens. He used a 12-inch focal length f3.7 portrait lens. So that's something like 3-inch diameter f3.7 portrait lens, and 7 seconds exposure. On the day before, probably, on the day before Bond took his image. And the picture that he got, because he was using a much faster photographic system, actually showed the coma and some of the tail of the comet. And this is where it gets really frustrating. There are loads of mentions of this in the RAS and in letters between various people and Bond in the States. Copies of the print were sent over to Harvard, copies of the print were discussed in London, but no one now can find this picture. So the picture that probably was the first ever photograph of a comet is, as far as we know, lost. It may be sitting in the bottom of a drawer somewhere, but people have looked for it. If anyone finds it, please let me know, because it's probably one of the most significant comet pictures that we know of. But one thing it really showed was, and people haven't realised this up to this point, that for extended objects, for faint fuzzy objects, you don't need large apertures with slow f ratios. You need small apertures with fast f ratios. And this was really shown as photography developed, because between that comet and the Great Comet of 1882 that was photographed at the Cape by David Gill, had been the invention of the dry plate, so photography became much more convenient to do. You didn't have to make your plates just before observing and then put it in your telescope and expose for hours whilst the photographic plate gradually ran into the bottom of the telescope because it was wet. You could actually use a dry plate. And David Gill, when this comet came along, learned the lessons from William Usherwood, and rather than trying to photograph it using the large telescope at the Cape Observatory, he borrowed a portrait camera and attached it to the refractor and just used the large refractor as a guide telescope. And he got this picture. So this is probably an exposure of a couple of hours or so on this comet on a gelatin dry plate. It's the first real pictures of a comet that looks like what we would see as a comet in the sky. And this had a huge impact, not really just because of the image of the comet that Gill had got, but because there were so many stars in this image. And it was at that point people realised that rather than doing star catalogues in the old traditional way, you could do them by photographing the sky. And so that basically inspired a thing called the Cape Photographic de Schmutzterung, which was a big star catalogue that they did at the Cape. And they used a 6-inch Dallmeyer f3.9 lens. This survey had 6.6 degree field of view. But to give you an example still of how slow emulsions were in those days, with that lens, a 60-minute exposure, they were getting to a limited magnitude of 9.5. And just to give you a comparison of what's going to happen in the next few years, the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, which is admittedly only 3 by 3 degrees, so a quarter of the field of view, gets to fainter than magnitude 24 in 30 seconds. So that's kind of how far we've come in the time. But I think you'll agree, that's a spectacular image, and that's 1882, when photographic plates were still incredibly slow. So the next person in our story is this guy, probably one of the greatest observers in history. This is Edward Emerson Barnard. This was him when he was 16, before he became a famous astronomer. And at that time, he worked as an assistant in a photographic studio in Nashville, in Tennessee. And one of his main jobs was to manage this thing. Anyone any idea what this is? Have a guess. It tracks the sun, but why would it track the sun? No, it's an enlarger. So this is a photographic enlarger. Right? So basically, to make big prints, you needed lots of bright sunshine, And this thing was basically an enlarging camera, so it would effectively make copy prints. And he had to track the sun with this to do that. So that was his first job. But the reason he's important in astronomy, in cometary astronomy, well, lots of reasons, but one of them is this. This is the first comet discovered photographically, comet D1892T1, Barnard. It was discovered with a 15 centimetre, 6-inch Willard lens, and basically 4 minutes exposure, and that is the comet there trailed on the image. And this was the first ever discovery using photography. It's called D1892T1 because then it was lost. And people thought it was lost for good, but actually it was rediscovered in 2008 by Andrea Bertini at Mount Lemmon. There it is, much fainter on here, and it's comet 206P. So Barnard was the first photographic comet discovery. He also made many comet images, which we would recognise today as extremely high quality images. So these were all using gelatin dry plates, still very slow plates. So they were very long exposures on fast systems, but again showing a lot of detail in comets. It was really that showed that photography as a tool in observing comets was a very powerful system to use. And it was probably Barnard more than anyone who actually did that. He kind of made it clear that photography was a tool that could be used both in cometary discovery and the morphology of comets. So that was a long time ago. That was kind of the end of the 19th century. So photography developed through the 20th century, and I'll skip over 50 years or so because not a great deal happened in terms of detectors. They got more and more sensitive, and we got to the kind of detectors that we're more familiar with, those of us who use photography. So films with kind of ISO ratings in the 50 to 100 to 400 or so ISO. And one of the great cometary photographers in the post-war years in the UK was this guy, Dr. Reginald Waterfield. He had an observatory at Ascot with a 6-inch Cook, and he took lots of comet images. And this one I particularly like because we complain these days, and we'll probably be complaining even more with the Starlink satellites. If you take a picture, you'll always get some streak across it from an aircraft or a satellite. Now, this is actually a 20-minute exposure of comet Aaron Rowland from 1957 April. And even in 1957, look, he's got an aircraft going across the comet. The big difference, of course, then was that for us now with digital imaging, we can take lots and lots of frames and we can stack them and we can use ways statistically to remove those trails. From Waterfield's point of view, he'd just taken 20 minutes taking this and all the time setting it up and all the time developing it. And you take it out of the developer and what do you have for a picture of a comet spoiled by this aircraft trail across it. But we have a load of pictures, a load of photographs by Reggie Waterfield in the archive. And this isn't a Reggie Waterfield picture, but you can come and see it later. These are the kind of size of film we use. These are 8 by 10 photographic film. Reggie was actually using glass plates, but later on people used photographic film. So when you think of the kind of size of detectors that we now have, most of us using kind of really tiny CCDs, in those days people used film of this size. So even though you've got a 6-inch Cook at f7 or whatever, which is a really long focal length, you can get a really large field of view because you've got a large detector. But essentially what you were doing is you were putting this into a plate holder, you were taking an image of the comet for however long the exposure was, you then take it out of the plate holder, take it away and develop it. And I'll go through a few of the techniques that you had to do to actually do comet imaging in those days when we get to the kind of more modern era, the kind of 80s, which was the heyday of outer comet photography. A little bit after Waterfield came along another 3 top BAA people who were really top comet imagers as well. So the person on the left there is Harold Ridley. Harold was president of the BAA. There's the Ridley Grant, is one of our grants, which is named after him. He was an absolute consummate comet photographer. In the middle, Brian Manning. I joked last week when I showed this picture that Brian was a much more competent observer than he was a gardener. But this is Brian with his dome and his telescope inside. And then on the right here, Michael Hendry, former director of the comet section. And the kind of pictures that they could get in those days were like this. So this is a picture of Comet Burnham, C1959Y1, taken in 1960. And this was taken with Reggie Waterfield's telescope, but by Mike Hendry and Harold Ridley. And essentially what they were doing here, so comets move with respect to the stars, and sometimes, if you're lucky enough and the comet's bright enough, you can guide your camera on the head of the comet, but most of the time you can't do that. You have to guide the camera on the stars. And you then have to work out a way to offset your image so that the comet is fixed and the stars are streaks. And there are a number of ways of doing that, but the most common way, the way they used, was to use a micrometer in their guiding eyepiece. And so what they would do is they would set up the micrometer in the position angle that the comet was predicted to move, and they would work out how far the comet was moving every 15, 20 seconds or whatever. And so effectively every 15 seconds they'd adjust the micrometer to accommodate that motion, and then they would guide on the micrometer line. So it was a really complicated thing to do. I mean, with this one, the comet was moving so fast, they say that every 15 seconds they had to adjust the micrometer and then guide on that. You imagine what you're doing here. You're maybe taking multiple exposures each night. This exposure is 70 minutes long. So if you screw up, if your guiding goes wrong, or if you, God forbid, if you get the position angle wrong, you don't know until you've gone through all the pain of doing that exposure for 70 minutes, come indoors, gone through all the pain of developing the plate, taking it out of the developing bath, and then finding that you've got a plate that's useless. That's why photography was so hard and why so few people did it. It required incredible dedication and incredible skill. And deep sky photography generally is difficult, but comet photography is even more difficult because the comets are moving and you're guiding on a moving target. So this is a lovely picture of a kind of typical spring onion comet taken by those two with Reggie Waterfield's telescope. If we then jump forward a little bit further to the 1980s, there was a famous comet that you've all heard of, Comet Halley 1P. Now, Comet Halley was coming back, and there was a lot of competition from amateur astronomers in the mid-80s to be the first people to photograph this comet on its return. So there are three famous people in this picture. One of them is a former president of the BAA, Henry Cooper, on the left. And the other two, so I'm sure you all know who that guy is. That's Ron Arbour. Anyone know who this is? Alan Young, that's right. So both Ron and Alan were kind of the leading photographers at the time. And they were in a pretty healthy competition to be the first person to pick up Halley on its return. The first UK person to pick it up. And one of the problems Ron had was that the comet was going to be behind a tree from where his telescope was in his garden. So he essentially dug up the entire telescope and moved it down the garden and plonked it on the patio in front of the house to get a clear view of the horizon. It didn't help though, because Alan Young got the picture first. About 15 minutes, I think, before Ron got his image, Alan Young got his image of the comet. This is Ron's image of Halley's comet. It's this kind of faint thing here. And to give you an example, really, of how different photography was in those days to what it is now. So this is, those of you who are old enough to remember as well, is there was almost kind of religious turf wars over what emulsion you should use. There were some people who used Tri-X, there were some people who used HP5, and a little bit later there were some people who used a film called Technical Pan. And there would be kind of religious wars between people about which was the best. Anyway, this is on Tri-X, which was a goodish film for its time. It was an ISO 400 film. This is a picture by Renard. It's a 5-minute exposure with a 0.4 metre telescope. Now, to give you an example of what photography was like then, the estimated magnitude of Halley at that time was 14th magnitude. Jonathan Shanklin saw it visually that night. He was the first visual observer in the UK. So people photographing comets, even in the mid-80s, the best comet photographers we had, using the best techniques we had, were struggling to beat what visual observers could do. You know, 14th magnitude now is nothing, but that's 14th magnitude. So that's two observers and the next president of the BAA. I put the next one in because I know that Peter was going to be here. So Peter at the back, who still does huge amounts of comet observing, took this picture of Comet Halley a little bit later. This is in November the 11th, 1985, on 1,000 ISO. 1,000 ISO transparency. So really, really fast film. Peter, do you know what magnitude Halley was at the time you took this picture?
I don't know, obviously a bit brighter than...
About 12. Yeah. So if you think in the context of now, what sort of exposure would show up a 12 magnitude comet? Probably a few seconds or something like that. Whereas this is a 60-second exposure. But again, just showing how film transparency works. That's not to say that film was rubbish. If you actually used it at really dark sites with good techniques, you could do amazing things. And this is a picture of Halley taken by Richard Jones, I think it is, from Tenerife. And the reason I put it here is it shows a few things which people who are into digital imaging don't kind of realise that you could do with them. So you can sit in front of Lightroom and you can sit in front of Photoshop and you can do all sorts of clever things with your digital images. Well, people could do the same kinds of things with film, it's just it was a hell of a lot more difficult. So people could do unsharp masks, they could do amplification, they could do contrast stretching, all this kind of stuff. But rather than just dragging a few sliders on a desktop computer, it involved lots of complicated work in the darkroom to do. But what he's done here is use photographic amplification to bring out the very, very faint features of the comet. So again, this is on Tri-X. This is 400 ISO Tri-X. And this is probably a good time to just say a little bit about what ISO is, what it means, and how it relates to what we think of today in terms of the sensitivity of digital cameras, because there's lots of rubbish kind of talked about what digital cameras are in terms of ISO. So ISO is basically a number that relates the density on a photographic negative to the exposure time and intensity of the picture that you're taking a picture of. What it doesn't do is tell you the signal to noise ratio. And to give you an example of that, I could take a picture on a piece of Tri-X film and I could develop it in a particular developer for a short period of time, and that film would be quite transparent. I once tried some of Mike Maunder's Celestella and I didn't follow the instructions, and I developed, this Celestella was an incredibly aggressive developer, which I used to, because Mike told me it'd be brilliant, so I used to develop one of my comet pictures at 20 degrees for about 4 minutes, which is what I used for D19. And effectively the negative came out and it used it as a solar filter. It was that dense. So effectively what I'd gone from a film that was probably 400 ISO to a film that was 20,000 ISO. The problem wasn't 20,000 ISO wasn't useful. It was just like I'd made the film much, much darker, but I hadn't actually made the image any better. And so with digital cameras, there's not a direct relationship between that. We now talk about quantum efficiency, which is a much more direct relationship between the brightness of an object and the signal to noise of an image. ISOs, as far as digital cameras are concerned, are just really telling you how much amplification has been applied beyond a certain point on the sensor to make the image appear stronger. So it's very difficult to relate film ISOs to digital sensitivity. But even the best kind of films in terms of what we now consider to be quantum efficiencies, we're probably in the 2 to 3 to maybe 4% quantum efficiencies, whereas digital detectors now are in the 90%. So this was the 1980s. People did a lot more than just take pretty pictures of comets, they did astrometry as well. So astrometry is measuring positions. And it was very important to do that because when a comet was discovered, you could use these positions to calculate its orbit and predict where it was going to go in the future. Now these days, of course, astrometry is a matter of putting an image into a program like Astrometrica, clicking a button. Astrometrica identifies the stars in the image with a catalogue that it gets offline or off your computer disk, and it spits out a number in a fraction of a second. That's not how it worked in the photographic era. You had to use a thing called a measuring engine. And these are two examples of measuring engines. This is a professional one, a Zeiss measuring engine. So basically what you do is you put your photographic negative or plate or whatever in this. It was a micrometer microscope. You would measure very precisely the XY coordinates of some reference stars on that. And you'd look up in a catalogue what the positions of those were. You'd correct those positions for proper motion. You'd then do lots of complicated calculations, and eventually you'd come out with a comet position. I did this once using a measuring engine at Dennis's observatory up in Lancaster, and it took me the best part of a whole Saturday to get one comet position by doing this measurement. But the thing was, is in those days, because it was really hard to do, there were not very many people doing it. And so those people who did do it were producing fantastic science. In fact, at one point, amateurs were producing, I think, the majority of the astrometry that was used by the Minor Planet Centre for comet orbit determination. Now, not everyone can have one of these big Zeiss measuring engines, so Mike Hendry actually made one himself. It's the same principle, quite a lot smaller because it worked with film negatives rather than plates. And this had digital readout, and eventually people had BBC microcomputers that actually did all the calculations for them as well. So things kind of really moved forward quite rapidly. And in 1985, 86 for the Halley Watch, this was one of their meetings for people who were doing astrometry, so quite a lot of people in here that observers can't recognise. Brian Marsden here. Standing behind him is Mike Hendry. Peter Burtwhistle is in there somewhere. But basically this was the kind of group of people doing astrometry in the mid-80s. Now I've recently taken over the Comet Section archive from Jonathan Shanklin, and I've been going through it, and one of our objectives is to take all of the photographic images we have and gradually scan them and put them into an archive. And this is another of the aspects of photography which is so different to today, digital imaging. Whilst digital imaging is very easy to handle and very easy to store, you know, I opened some envelopes here that haven't been opened for 30 years, 40 years in some cases, and I could actually see the pictures on the prints. You know, if in 40 years' time somebody opens an envelope that's got DVD in it, then you know, will they actually be able to read it? But there is a big advantage to having stuff scanned in that at least you can catalogue and find stuff. And I really like this slide. This shows what it was like in the days when you had lots and lots of slides. This is Mike Collins, actually, when he was doing his Nova Patrol. I think what he'd done here is he's sorted his slides by declination and right ascension. So this is the kind of thing that you would do with a kind of spreadsheet or a database now. But you know, there was a physicality about slides and photography in those days. Well, it's like as if you made a jigsaw or something and somebody came here and knocked it over and you'd be very happy. So we move on a bit, not quite to the modern era, but to people who are possibly more recognisable than some of the old timers here. So these four people, left to right, Glenn Marsh, who sadly died a few years ago and went on with us, Dennis Kaczynski, who's famous for his comet imaging, Martin Mobley, who is also famous for his comet imaging and a few other things besides, and then me on the end. And this was during a visit to Martin's house. This is his Paramount C14 on the back of it. And Martin, Dennis and Glyn were really the sort of consummate comet observers through the 90s. I did start comet imaging at that time, but I never really got into the very long exposure offset guided comet photography. It was really hard work. Glyn and Dennis had a particular thing about large telescopes, and this is a lovely example of that. This is a Ross Express lens and a Zeiss triplet mounted on the Mond Equatorial. So the Mond Equatorial came from the Norman Lockyer Observatory and went up eventually to Glyn's observatory in Catford. So this was a really big photographic system. And Glyn got this working just in time for two of the greatest comets that we've seen and they arrived in the mid-90s. So that was Comet Hyakutake 96b2, which was bright in sort of 1996 March and April, and then Hale-Bopp. And this is just a picture of this, and you can have a look at it later if you want. So just to give you an example of sizes and how things have changed. So this is an 8x10 negative that Glyn would have put at the focus of those lenses. This is a picture of Hale-Bopp, of course. So this is actually the focal plane image. This is essentially the film that was in that plane. To give you an idea of how big that is compared to what most of us were using, this is 35mm film. This is actually, I think this is 2415. But basically, you see a kind of idea of the aerial difference between them. So these big lenses were using large sheet film. So in terms of resolution, you had a huge number of pixels in this image. I mean, we talk these days about multi-megapixel, 100 megapixel cameras. If you scan this, you're talking hundreds of megapixels. Really large detector. And because they got them on going just at the right time, we got some fantastic images from that. So this is Dennis and Glyn's image of Hale-Bopp, taken with that system, showing just some incredible details in the tank. There were several reasons that Glyn managed to get such good images. He was an extremely good observer, he had extremely good equipment, but also he was a chemist. And so he knew a lot about how to get the best from his film. And one of the things that photographers will remember, but digital images won't go anything without, is a thing called reciprocity failure. So reciprocity failure sounds complicated, it isn't really. You'd expect, if the film was perfect, if you doubled the exposure, you would expect to get double the density of the film. But that didn't work. Because of the chemistry of film, beyond exposures of about 1 second long, film started to lose sensitivity. So what this plot shows here is for a number of films at the time, HP5 and T-Max 400, both good films, were about 400 ISO for short exposures. Once you got to 10 seconds, they had an equivalent sensitivity of only about 200 ISO. Once you got to 100 seconds, they had an equivalent sensitivity of only about 100 ISO. And that kept falling off. And so it meant that the longer you were exposed for, the weaker, the slower the film was that you had. Now, that was kind of livable with. Another thing about these films, though, is because, again, of the chemistry of fast films generally were associated with large grains, and that was associated with low resolution. And so both those films had a resolution of about 40 lines per millimetre for high contrast images. If you try and put that in digital terms, if you wanted to sample 40 lines per millimetre, you need 80 pixels per millimetre. So you double that number, and to get the pixel size, you then take the reciprocal of it. So 40 lines per millimetre is the equivalent of about 1/80th of a millimetre pixel size, so quite large. 125 lines per millimetre is 250 pixels a millimetre, which is about 4 microns per pixel. So that's the kind of pixel size that we have with our digital. And these two lines are actually for a film called Technical Pan. Now, Technical Pan was a film that was developed as a copy film. It was developed as a very, very high-resolution film that would be used to copy documents. It was a fairly slow film in its native ISO. It was about ISO 60 or something like that. Depended a lot on how you developed it. But it was a very, very high-resolution film. And people found fairly quickly, they knew about a thing called hypersensitization. And hypersensitization was a method you could use to both increase the sensitivity of the film and also reduce the reciprocity failure. And people knew that worked with films of different types, but surprised with technical panels just how well it worked. It made a huge difference. At long exposures, it made a difference of probably 10 to 20 times in terms of the sensitivity. Now, the way to hypersensitize film is you bake it at high temperature in a gas, and the gas that most people used, because they were kind of wusses and worried about the health and safety issues, was a thing called forming gas, which is a mixture of, I think, 90-something% nitrogen and the remainder being hydrogen. Now, Glyn was a chemist. He worked in the nuclear industry. He knew all about health and safety and all kinds of things. And so what Glyn did was go straight to actually baking the film in neat hydrogen. So basically what you do is you get your 2415, here's a sheet film. You stick it in a pressure chamber. You pump the pressure chamber full of hydrogen at high pressure, and you heat it up to a high temperature. What could possibly go wrong? But what you end up with after leaving your film in this for hours is film which is much more sensitive and has much lower reciprocity failure than it started off with. So 2415, right at the end of the photographic era, was the film that people used. It had the amazing properties of very high resolution, high-ish sensitivity, and fairly low reciprocity failure. So nearly everybody used 2415, apart from Ron Arber, who never, ever accepted that 2415 was as good as TMS 400. And if you look back in the journal, in the days when the journal had some really animated letters discussions, there was a lot of discussions on the various merits of different films. But essentially that's where we were in the kind of mid-90s or so, or the early 90s. We'd reached a point where film was pretty much as good as it was ever going to get. 2415 was an extraordinary film, and I used it for comet photography. I used it for this picture of Comet Haitaki from Tenerife, where the comet was at its closest to us. Guiding in this case on the bright centre condensation. This was some of Glyn's magical 2415. I remember it would come in the post wrapped in aluminium foil. I would immediately put it in the freezer and then use it fairly quickly after it arrived. And I have a huge debt of gratitude to Glyn for what he did in terms of providing me with this film. You could buy Hyper 2415 commercially. It was incredibly expensive and nowhere near as good as the stuff that Glyn produced. So just moving on a little bit to sort of the mechanics of how we did comet imaging in those days, and this kind of becomes a terrible shock to those people who kind of image comets now. So in those days you essentially had a piece of film, which was this thing that you put at the focal plane of your telescope, and you could look at the back of the camera, but you couldn't actually see any image there. I mean, there was nothing to see. You could look through the viewfinder, but there was no image of what was on the film. So you could, and I did, take several exposures with cameras where I hadn't actually loaded any film, which is irritating. You could, and I did, get into a right panic when you were taking the film out of the camera at the end and trying to put it on this plastic spiral in what was called euphemistically a developing bag, which was basically a black bag where you got very, very sweaty and all the film got stuck. And the nasty thing about 2415 was that it was very, very thin, and so it was very keen to not go down the rails of the spiral. So you could have spent an entire night imaging comets and then find you wreck them when you try to put them on the spiral. Or you can do what I did with this picture. This is a famous comet. This is 109P Swift-Puckett. This is the parent comet of the Perseid. And I prepared for this. You can see it's offset guided. What I used at the time was this guide scope on the side of my lovely Pulsoscopes Newtonian on its very agricultural Mark IV mount. Douglas was not a mechanical engineer, but it was okay, that telescope. And what I used was a Meade illuminated reticle. I worked out the position angle, and I recorded on a tape recorder effectively every time I needed to move one step on the guide. So I then start that going. One thing you'll notice about old-fashioned telescopes is there's not the profusion of cables and wires and things that you used to have. There's only this thing, which is a remote camera thing, and it's not a USB remote camera thing. It's basically a little sort of air bulb here that you press, which opens the shutter up here. Because of course you're down here at the eyepiece of the guide telescope, and the camera's up here. So anyway, I did all of this. I offset guided patiently using everything I did. I then developed a picture. And yes, I've got lovely offset guided stars, but I've also got an offset comet. And what I've done is I've got the position angle wrong. And you can actually see that it's out by, I think, exactly 90 degrees, because the comet, rather than being a dot, is a streak in the opposite direction to the streaks of the stars. That's really irritating. And you know, these days if you do that, you just restack your images with the right offsetting, but you couldn't do that in those days. But I did get some good images, and this is Swift Tuttle taken through that telescope, 4 minutes exposure on Piper 2415. You'll notice again, and I can process this digitally now, but one of the things that we couldn't do very easily in those days was take out sky gradients. So those of us who image in light polluted environments now don't really even give it a thought that we can remove digitally the sky gradient across the image. It's extremely difficult to do photographically. Anyway, Ron thought that was all far too difficult, and so he invented this, which is his offset guiding camera. So what this does is that you put the camera at the prime focus, you program it up at the right step rate, and then you guide on a star, and the camera itself is moved across the focal plane. That's really nifty, really clever. And if you look back in the journals for that era, you'll find all sorts of clever stuff that people did to make their comet imaging easier. So in the last few minutes, I just want to kind of come up to date. I'll skip over this because talking about digital detectors is a whole other talk. But basically, CCDs came along for professionals probably in the late 70s to the 80s, but for amateur observers, they really only became practical when people like Terry Platt actually designed and built and sold CCD systems for amateurs to use at what were reasonable prices. I mean, they're eye-wateringly expensive prices compared to what you pay now for an imaging system, but they were kind of within the scope of what amateurs can do. And this is one of the first cameras that Terry came up with. This is the SX frame store camera. So those of you who are now used to buying a camera and plugging it into the USB port on your PC and everything working fine, will be rather surprised to know that the first camera came with a huge box with lots of switches on it. You had to buy yourself a TV monitor to plug into the box to actually see what the picture was. And essentially you'd set up all your exposure and everything on a set of switches and press some buttons, and this thing would take exposures. It would then download them into the memory here and display it on the monitor, and then it would take kind of quite a long time. I can't remember exactly how long, but it certainly felt like minutes to download any good ones that you wanted into the computer. But that was, even though it was primitive, it was the first sort of amateur CCD camera that was practical for the UK amateurs to use. And I had one of these in 1994. The parallel port version of that, which did actually directly connect to a computer, and almost immediately I stopped doing commentary photography through the telescope, but not generally photography with film. Because one of the other problems was the image sensor here was incredibly tiny. Now Martin Mobley at the time had just had this telescope installed. This is strangely a bit squished. This is a 19-inch telescope, and it's 19-inch f5, I think, something like that. So quite long focal length. And he was using this with SX cameras. It's got incredibly tiny fields of view. But then he actually went on to, this is the MX916, which is a somewhat larger chip, and this is an example of IKEA Zhang, Comet IKEA Zhang taken with that, showing again that CCDs were very, very sensitive, but they had very, very small fields. So what we've done is we've gone from photographic stuff, which was fairly slow and insensitive, but big, to CCDs that were small. And over the last 20 odd years or so, we've been gradually inching our way back up to what we have in terms of the size of detectors. So this is a 35mm film frame. This is the kind of old Starlight Express size. This is the SX9. This is one of the new ZWO cameras. This is the ASI294, which has got quite a big sensor. You can see they're still much smaller than photographic films. The big advantage is they're much more sensitive, and they've got small pixels, so you can use them on small telescopes. So this is a picture I took with one of those cameras, the ASI294, on a short focus refractor. And effectively you're getting down in this exposure to about magnitude 17 over a field of view of something like 1.5 by 2.5 degrees. So the other thing is not CCDs, but the fact that the world is moving to what's called CMOS sensors. And cameras have evolved. This is my old Canon T70 that I used to use with film to take comet images. This is my Canon DSLR, which is a mirror-based single-lens reflex camera. And this is the Sony A7S, which is a mirrorless camera, full-frame 35mm mirrorless camera based on a CMOS imaging. To give you an example of the size, we're then back up with this camera to 35mm film, much bigger than the kind of sensors in older cameras. But the absolute ultimate, and if you've got the money, you can now buy sensors like this. This is the Sony IMX211. It's a CMOS sensor, so CMOS is essentially taking over from CCD. It's a 67mm diagonal sensor with 100 megapixels. This is one hell of a sensor. So if you've got enough money to afford, let's say, a big 17-inch plane wave telescope that's got a nice flat field of 60mm diameter or so, this is the camera you want. This is now kind of back up to medium format photography, but in a digital imaging. I did have a look to see if anyone makes cameras with these. The only camera I could find at the moment is about $20,000. So they're not cheap. The other thing we can do with digital images, of course, is we can operate telescopes remotely. And so here's an example. This is Kevin Hill's telescope, which is set up in the Bahamas. So digital imaging allows us now to put telescopes far away and operate them remotely, rather than having to load film into the cameras. So it's been a quick journey, sort of 160 years of progress from this, which was David Gill's picture of the Great Comet of September 1882, taken on a dry gelatin plate, probably a sensitivity of an 1 ISO or something like that. Through to this, which is Elizabeth Rover's picture, Recovery of Comet P direct, taken with a 2.3 metre telescope, 23-minute exposure, and it's about magnitude 18. This was in the early 70s. Through to what we can do these days. This was taken with my telescope. It's a 20th magnitude comet, taken with a 11-inch Celestron telescope from a light-polluted back garden. Now, of course, the professionals will always have bigger and better sensors. And, you know, talking about the size of sensors, this is the sensor that's going to go, or just a model of it, the sensor that's going to go into the LSST. So this is the kind of thing that us amateurs will be competing against in the future. A sensor like this. So magnitude 24 and 30 seconds over a 3 by 3 degree field of view. So I hope you found that interesting. There are just a couple of things on the horizon. So basically everything gets better, doesn't it? Everything in life always gets better. Debatable. As far as photographic detectors, that's probably true. But there's two things that have got worse. One of them we all know about, which is this one, light pollution. Something that people didn't have to worry about really up until kind of, well, people did complain a bit in the 50s and 60s, but nothing like what we've got today. And of course what we've done is we've used digital imaging, those of us who image, to kind of help us cut through that. And I can get 20th magnitude comets from my back garden, which is in the middle of this red dot here in Chelmsford. But that doesn't mean that, light pollution is something that we ought to live with, just because we've got the sensors that allow us to cope with it. And all of us who know who do digital imaging and go out to dark sites, how much better we can do from there. So light pollution is one, but the other one, which you may have seen a clip I was showing before, this is a real worry potentially. These are the SpaceX Starlink satellites. This is the first launch of Starlink with 60 satellites on. This is a picture I took from Chelmsford, video I took from Chelmsford Sunday night. This is just a short clip, but I've got all 60 gradually going through. Ultimately, there's going to be thousands and thousands of these things. And whilst we can cope with various image processing techniques with a few satellites going across a few frames, I do worry that things like this are going to be an even worse problem to us, potentially, than light pollution. So we'll have to see. But that's basically photography right the way from basically making your own emulsion with ether and gum cotton through to buying CCD cameras and using them in your backyard. Thank you very much.